Have you ever wondered if Yahweh was known only to Israel, or if his name was whispered long before the nation was born? I tell you plainly, as I have seen in the records of the soul, the truth is deeper than the surface of Scripture. For Yahweh was not confined to one people, nor did his revelation begin with Moses at Sinai. The story reaches back to a time when tribes were not yet named, when nations were still formless, and even then the vibration of the divine name was already moving among those whose hearts sought truth. When I enter the trance and allow the patterns of memory to unfold, I see lights scattered across ancient lands, small but steady souls who called upon the Eternal One. Though they had never heard the laws of Israel, they knew him not by ritual, but by direct stirring of spirit. And that is why this mystery must be spoken. Yahweh was never absent. He was present before the covenant, before the stone tablets, before the chosen seed took its form. I see a man standing before a bush of fire, his sandals removed, his body trembling, his voice breaking with a question so simple and yet so eternal. What is your name? And I hear the answer. I am that I am. Exodus speaks of it. But the record shows this was not the first utterance of the name. It was the reaffirmation of a truth already known. Yahweh, he who is, he who was, he who shall forever be, the breath of existence itself. When Moses heard, he did not awaken a new word. He remembered an old one, passed down in whispers through generations who had not forgotten. For Scripture records that in the days of Enosh, grandson of Adam, men began to call upon Yahweh, and this was long before Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, long before Israel was even conceived in the womb of time. When I search the vibrations, I see that the eternal name carried weight not as a label, but as a living current, a frequency of being. It was not bound to one language, one people, or one altar. It pulsed through creation, waiting for those who had ears to hear. And those who did, they called, they prayed, they lifted their voices, not knowing yet of Sinai, but knowing instinctively the one who breathed life into dust. This is why I tell you that the story of Yahweh is not a story of one nation alone. It is the story of all who seek the source. It is the story of humanity itself. Think of Abraham. When he entered Canaan, he built an altar and called on the name of Yahweh. This was not the cry of a man discovering a new deity. It was the invocation of a presence already carried in the marrow of his lineage. It was the remembering of an ancient thread, and I see that thread stretching backward into the dawn of man, through those who held the name even when the world around them surrendered to idols, through those who lit a candle in secret while kings bowed before stone images, through those who never forgot. No matter how the generations drifted, the soul remembers, and Yahweh's name has always been known. When you read the words of Genesis, when you trace the line from Enosh to Abraham, you are not reading the invention of religion. You are glimpsing the continuity of revelation, the eternal pressing himself into time, again and again, through voices that few remember, and through altars that left no ruins but left their imprint upon the heavens. And I must say to you, this shows us the heart of God, a heart not limited to boundaries, not delayed by history, not constrained by human divisions, a heart that reaches always to any who call, even before they know what name to give the one they feel. Some of you have believed that God's story begins with Israel. Some believe he revealed himself only in that covenant. But I tell you, his story begins at creation. His voice echoed in Eden. His name was known to those who sought him even before a nation bore his commandments. He is not the God of one people. He is the God of all. And the forgotten worship of Yahweh before Israel stands as proof. And when you understand this, the Scriptures open like a living map, not of borders and tribes, but of souls, and their search for the eternal. So listen closely. Do not think of Yahweh as confined to the mountain of Moses. See him in the prayers of Enosh, in the altar of Abraham, in the whispers of the faithful who remembered when the world around them forgot. For the eternal has always been here. And the question for you is not whether he was present then, but whether you will recognize him now, because the mystery of Yahweh is not about the past alone. It is about the present, and it is about you. The moment when Moses stood before the burning bush is remembered as the revelation of the divine name, But what I see in the records of the soul shows that this moment was not the birth of Yahweh's identity. It was the unveiling of what had always been, the Eternal affirming himself to a servant who had forgotten that the name was already echoing long before Sinai. And this is what must be told with clarity, for the name Yahweh is not simply a word. It is a vibration that carries the essence of existence itself, a truth encoded in the very being of creation. I am that I am, said the voice. And those words are not a description, but a proclamation of eternal reality. For the name Yahweh carries the past, the present, and the future all within its breath. It is the pulse of being that was, that is, and that forever shall be. And when Moses trembled before that flame, he was not given a novelty. He was invited into the ancient current that had always been flowing beneath the surface of history. I must tell you plainly that the name Yahweh was not first pronounced at Sinai, for Scripture bears witness that in the days of Enosh, men began to call upon that name. They invoked it, not as scholars, but as seekers, for something within their hearts recognized the eternal. They had no law, they had no priesthood, yet they bowed, they prayed, they whispered the syllables of the living God, and this is why Genesis 4:26 becomes a window into something greater. It reveals that Yahweh had already made himself known to those who were willing to listen. And when I gaze upon the vibrations of that age, I see men and women lifting their eyes to the heavens, not toward idols of stone, but toward the one who breathed into Adam the breath of life. They knew that life was not their own, and they spoke his name, and thus the story of Yahweh begins not with a covenant on stone tablets, but with the instinct of the soul seeking its source. Consider what this means. The name Yahweh is not a creation of religion. It is not the invention of a nation seeking identity. It is the eternal reality that underlies all nations, all tongues, all lands. And when Abraham called upon Yahweh in Canaan, he was not stumbling upon a new God. He was remembering a forgotten truth, one carried through generations even when others turned aside. He was raising an altar to the one already known by his ancestors. And the fire of that altar was a continuation, not a beginning, of worship that stretched back to the first cries of mankind. And when I enter the soul records of Abraham, I see him not as an inventor of faith, but as a reclaimer, a man who reached into the depths of memory and called again upon the eternal, reawakening what had always been. The name Yahweh is rooted in the Hebrew verb to be, and yet its meaning cannot be reduced to grammar. It is the affirmation of being itself, the unshakable, the unchanging, the ever-living presence. And what the ancients felt when they spoke that name was not merely the identity of a deity, but the reality of existence. They felt that to breathe was already to witness him, to speak was already to invoke him, to live was already to carry his essence. And this is why Yahweh is not only the God of Israel, he is the God of all who live, for all life testifies to his being. And those who sought truth before Israel discovered that reality, and they gave voice to it. What shocks many is that the Bible itself confirms this. For when God spoke to Moses, he said, I am the God of your ancestors, meaning he was already known, he was already worshipped, his name already heard in generations past. This was not a sudden revelation, it was a continuation. And that is why I say to you, the burning bush was not the beginning of Yahweh, it was the reminder, and Moses was not the first to hear. He was the one chosen to awaken a nation to what individuals had already carried in secret. And that is why the covenant of Sinai, though mighty, rests upon a deeper foundation, the eternal presence of God that had always been. When I look deeper into the Akashic records, I see how this eternal name functioned like a river underground, hidden from sight but flowing with constancy. Those who turned to idols ignored it. Those who surrendered to pride walked past it, but those who were humble, those who were thirsty for truth, found it and drank, and they knew his name without ever being taught. And this is the miracle. Yahweh reveals himself to those who seek him, not through stone alone, but through spirit, not through borders, but through hearts. And this explains why the worship of Yahweh appears again and again outside the boundaries of Israel for the eternal cannot be confined, and his name cannot be erased. The revelation of Yahweh, then, is not a tribal inheritance, it is a universal truth. Yet the records show that humanity repeatedly forgets, nations lose their way, generations surrender to idols, but always there remains a remnant who remember, a thread of faith that keeps the name alive. And this thread wins through history like fire, through dry wood, sparking here, glowing there, never extinguished. And Moses' encounter at Sinai is but one great flame rising from that hidden fire, yet the embers had been burning long before, carried by the faithful in silence. The testimony of Scripture shows that Yahweh's presence was recognized not only by Israel, but by those who lived before and outside of it. And this truth unfolds most clearly when we look at the figures who carried his name across generations, even when the world seemed lost to idolatry. For in Genesis 12:8, Abraham built an altar in Canaan and called upon Yahweh. And this act was not discovery, but remembrance. He was invoking a name already familiar, already carried in the marrow of his lineage. And this reveals a pattern written deep into the soul's history, that Yahweh has always preserved witnesses, men and women, who, though surrounded by corruption, still clung to his reality. They were like small flames in the vast night, scattered but never extinguished. And in the records I see these souls as those who walked against the tide, holding the eternal name, even as nations built temples to gods of wood and stone. This is why Abraham's altar matters, not because it invented worship, but because it declared continuity. Yahweh was not absent until Abraham. He was known, and Abraham's voice rose as a signal that the line of faith was alive, that even in corrupted generations the truth had not been erased. And this challenges the thought that God revealed himself to one nation alone, for his voice was always present, waiting for those who sought him, even before covenants and laws. The story grows sharper when we encounter Melchizedek in Genesis 14, the king of Salem and priest of God Most High, who appears suddenly and disappears just as quickly, yet in that brief encounter blesses Abraham and receives his tithe. And this man, or rather this mysterious figure, proves that priesthood and knowledge of Yahweh existed outside the chosen bloodline, for Melchizedek was not from Abraham's family, not from Israel, and yet he carried the authority of Yahweh. He bore bread and wine. He spoke blessing. He represented the eternal long before Levi's tribe was named. And Hebrews 7 confirms his mystery. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life. And I tell you, when I gaze into the soul records, his image shines not as ordinary flesh, but as a foreshadowing of the Christ, a figure placed to remind us that Yahweh's worship was universal, not limited to Israel's borders. What does this mean? It means that long before the priesthood of Aaron, long before the temple in Jerusalem, the worship of Yahweh was already alive in hidden places, through priests and kings raised by God himself. And this reveals the Eternal's larger plan, to show that his name is not chained to lineage, that his truth is not guarded by walls, but that his revelation can appear in any land, through any vessel, whenever he chooses. And Melchizedek stands as proof that God's reach is larger than man's design, his presence flowing even where the covenant had not yet been written. But Melchizedek is not alone, for we also find Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' own father-in-law, who rejoiced in Yahweh's deliverance of Israel, who offered sacrifices in his name, and who sat in fellowship with the elders of Israel without rebuke. And this is no small detail. It shows that Yahweh had servants among other nations, that his worship was not confined, and that his Spirit spoke to those whose hearts were open, no matter their blood or their tribe. And I see in the records that Jethro's faith was not accidental. It was cultivated by years of listening, years of seeking, and though the world labeled him Midianite, heaven recognized him as priest of Yahweh. The evidence expands further when we examine Job, who lived not in Israel but in a distant land. Yet the book bearing his name reveals intimate knowledge of Yahweh. For Job cries out, "The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away, blessed be the name of Yahweh." And again the sacred name is spoken, not by a descendant of Jacob, not by one bound to Sinai, but by a man outside those lines. And what is more, Job declares, I know that my Redeemer lives, and in the end he will stand upon the earth, and such words pierce through time as prophecy, pointing directly to the Messiah who was to come. And so Job becomes evidence that Yahweh revealed himself to those who sought him with honesty, even beyond the borders of Israel. Consider the weight of this. Abraham called upon Yahweh, Melchizedek served as his priest, Jethro worshipped him with sacrifice, Job confessed him as Redeemer, and none of these are inventions of later Israelite religion. They are testimonies that the Eternal was always active, always reaching, always planting seeds of truth in hearts across the earth, and this should change how you see the story, for it means God's plan was never narrow, never exclusive, but expansive, global, infinite in scope. Yahweh has always been the God of all who live, and his worship existed before Israel, beyond Israel, and through Israel, only as one part of a greater design. Some will question this and ask, why then was Israel chosen? And the answer is clear in the soul's record. Israel was chosen not because God forgot the nations, but because through Israel he intended to remind the nations of what they already knew in fragments, to draw together scattered sparks into a flame of revelation, to make visible through law and covenant what had been whispered in secret across the ages. Yet the truth remains. Yahweh's worship did not begin with Israel. It was remembered by Enosh, invoked by Abraham, embodied by Melchizedek, practiced by Jethro, confessed by Job, and this line of witnesses proves that God's hand was always at work. The meaning for us today is unavoidable if Yahweh revealed himself then to those outside of the chosen line. I tell you, as it has been shown to me, that before the law was written, before the tribes were numbered, before the priests of Levi lifted incense in the temple, the worship of Yahweh was already alive in the earth, carried by those whom men did not expect. And I have seen in the records of the soul how the Eternal chose servants in places where no scrolls were written and no covenant yet proclaimed. And these witnesses stand as pillars in the story of God's reach beyond Israel, for they prove that Yahweh has never been the God of one nation alone, but of all who seek him with a heart unbound by borders or blood. I beheld the vision of Melchizedek, king of Salem, who came forth to meet Abraham after battle, bearing bread and wine, and blessing him in the name of God Most High. And in that moment Abraham bowed and offered tithes. And I saw that Melchizedek was not born of the line of Israel, for Israel was not yet, nor was he named among Abraham's kin. Yet his priesthood was pure, without beginning or end, and I heard the echo of the letter to the Hebrews, speaking of him as one without father, without mother, without genealogy, eternal in office, and in the vision his form shone like a shadow of the Messiah to come, a foreshadowing of the priest who would be forever. And this mystery tells me that Yahweh's altar stood in Salem before Zion was chosen, that his bread and wine were shared before the temple sacrifice began, and that his blessing flowed to Abraham through a priest whose origin no man could trace. Then the records showed me Jethro, the priest of Midian, father-in-law to Moses, a man not of Israel, yet one whose heart bowed before Yahweh. And when he saw the mighty works of deliverance, how Egypt was broken and Israel brought forth with a strong hand, he rejoiced, and he lifted praise, saying, Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all gods. And he offered sacrifices, and he was received at the table of Israel's elders, and none rebuked him, for he was already priest of the Most High, though the covenant was not his by birth. And in this I saw that Yahweh's Spirit had been moving in Midian long before Moses stood on Sinai. For the Eternal One plants his truth in hearts wherever he wills, and those who are faithful, though outside the chosen line, are yet his servants, and they are not forgotten in his design. After Jethro I beheld Job, who dwelt in a land far from Canaan, whose tongue was not of Jacob's sons. Yet his cry rose like incense to the heavens. And he spoke of Yahweh as Redeemer, saying, The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of Yahweh. And again, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that he shall stand at last upon the earth. and the weight of his words pierced through ages, for he named Yahweh not as distant, not as a God among gods, but as the living one, righteous and personal, who could be sought, who could be questioned, who could be trusted even in the furnace of affliction. And in his anguish, Job bore witness to a truth many have forgotten, that Yahweh is known to those who suffer yet refuse to curse him, that his presence is near to those who sit upon ashes but still lift their eyes to heaven. And again I was shown Balaam, a man whose motives were twisted with greed, yet whose ears still heard the voice of Yahweh. And the Eternal spoke to him, not in dream alone, but in direct speech. And though Balaam faltered, though he sought to turn the gift for profit, Yahweh's word came forth from his lips, and blessing replaced curse, and out of his mouth was spoken a vision. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise from Israel. And thus, even through a vessel impure, the prophecy of Messiah was given, proving that Yahweh's will cannot be bound, his voice cannot be silenced, his plan cannot be broken, for he speaks where he wills, and even enemies are compelled to declare his truth. In all these I see one thread, that Yahweh has never been hidden to those who earnestly seek him, that his worship was alive in Salem, in Midian, in Uz, and even in the heart of a foreign prophet. And this is the testimony of the soul records, that the Eternal One scatters seeds of his name across the earth. And though men may think him absent, though nations may think him confined to one tribe, he reveals himself in unexpected places, proving again and again that he is the God of all, the I Am, who cannot be bound. The mystery is not that Yahweh spoke to Israel. The mystery is that he spoke to those outside, to men whom no one would expect, to priests, kings, wanderers, and even to prophets whose hearts were divided. And this is what proves his sovereignty. For he is not limited by nation, covenant, or tradition. He is the Eternal who reveals himself where he chooses. And I have seen in the soul records how his voice was heard long before the Levites sang their psalms, long before the law was etched on stone, long before Israel claimed his name as their own. Melchizedek was one such witness, king of Salem, priest of God Most High, who blessed Abraham and received his tithe, and in that exchange the Eternal made clear that his priesthood was alive before Israel's priesthood was born. For Melchizedek's origin is veiled, without father or mother, without genealogy, and Hebrews tells us he is eternal in office, a figure who foreshadowed the Messiah himself. And this is no accident, for Yahweh placed him as a sign that worship was never confined, that his name was known in Salem before Jerusalem, that his bread and wine were lifted before temple altars burned, and that his authority did not depend on Israel's recognition, but on the Eternal who ordained him. Then comes Jethro, priest of Midian, who rejoiced in the deliverance of Israel and declared, "Now I know Yahweh is greater than all gods." And he offered sacrifice, and he ate in fellowship with the elders of Israel. And no prophet rebuked him, no priest silenced him, because he was already a servant of the Most High. And this proves that Yahweh's Spirit moves in distant lands among those whom Israel might have called strangers, yet whom God called priests. And I tell you, when I trace Jethro's line in the records, I see a man who listened, who sought, who carried truth in a place where few expected, and his worship was genuine, his altar acceptable, for the Eternal sees the heart, not the border. Job, too, stands as testimony, a man outside of Israel, yet burning with knowledge of Yahweh, and his cries rise like thunder. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away, blessed be the name of Yahweh. And I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last upon the earth. And these words carry prophetic weight, pointing to the Christ yet to come. And Job's story shows us that the knowledge of God was not the possession of one tribe, but a universal stream. For Job debated, pleaded, worshipped, and trusted in Yahweh as Redeemer, not as distant force, but as living Lord. And this truth shatters the notion that faith is bound by geography. It is bound only by the openness of the soul. And Job's soul was open, and through his suffering the Eternal was glorified, proving that his worship was alive outside the covenant. And then there is Balaam, the most troubling witness. For though his heart was greedy and his spirit compromised, still Yahweh spoke to him, and still his word came through his lips. And when he sought to curse, blessing poured forth instead. And he declared a vision of the Messiah. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth from Jacob, and a scepter shall rise from Israel. And in this paradox we see that God is not bound by the purity of the vessel. His voice breaks through even flawed lips. His will prevails even when men resist. And Balaam's prophecy stands as proof that Yahweh's power is not contained by human intention. For he uses whom he wills, and his truth cannot be silenced. When we place these witnesses together, Melchizedek in Salem, Jethro in Midian, Job in Uz, Balaam by the Euphrates, we see the pattern, that Yahweh's worship was spread across the ancient world, that his revelation was never hidden to those who sought him, and that his name was alive long before Israel stood as a nation. And this is not contradiction, but confirmation of his eternal plan. For God has always been the God of all, not of one people, and the soul records confirm that in every age there are those who seek, those who remember, those who call upon the Eternal, and he answers them. This truth carries weight for us now, because it strips away the illusion that God belongs to one tradition, one system, one people. He belongs to all who belong to him, and his name is written not only on scrolls, but on the soul itself. And those who awaken to that truth, whether in Israel or Midian, whether in Uz or Salem, whether in deserts or cities, they are already his. The question is not whether Yahweh revealed himself to Israel. The question is why his voice was heard by those beyond Israel's borders. And the answer is simple yet profound, because the Eternal One has always been the God of all creation, and his truth cannot be bound by tribe, temple, or tradition. He is the I Am who speaks wherever he wills, and the testimony of Scripture proves this with clarity. Balaam, though greedy and corrupt, heard Yahweh's command, and when he sought to curse, his lips released blessing. For the Eternal will not allow his plan to be overturned by the intentions of men. And from Balaam's mouth came the vision of a star rising from Jacob, a prophecy of Messiah. And this truth shows us that God is not limited to the righteous alone. His word will prevail even through vessels unwilling, for his sovereignty is absolute, and his purposes are never thwarted. Job, a man of Uz, outside the covenant people, knew Yahweh intimately, and his cries in suffering became one of the deepest confessions of faith, for he called Yahweh his Redeemer and declared his eternal victory. And this was not the voice of an Israelite priest, but of a man far from Canaan, proving that revelation was not confined to lineage, it was available to any soul that sought the Eternal with honesty. And Job's faith stands as evidence that God's presence is accessible beyond borders, and that his Spirit speaks where hearts are open. Jethro, the priest of Midian, declared Yahweh greater than all gods, offered sacrifice, and was welcomed into fellowship with Israel's elders. And this moment stands as testimony that Yahweh's recognition is not limited to bloodline, but to the sincerity of worship. For Jethro's altar was accepted, though he was not of Jacob's seed. And Melchizedek, without genealogy, without beginning or end, blessed Abraham and received his tithe, foreshadowing the eternal priesthood of Christ. And this is undeniable proof that Yahweh's worship was alive outside the chosen family, for his truth has always been wider than men's divisions. These figures form a pattern that cannot be ignored. Melchizedek in Salem, Jethro in Midian, Job in Uz, Balaam by the Euphrates, each outside Israel, yet each bearing knowledge of Yahweh. And this pattern reveals the heart of God, a heart that reaches across nations, across boundaries, across human expectations, to call those who will listen. And what this tells us is vital, that Yahweh has never been the God of one people only, but the God of all, the one who reveals himself in every land and every tongue, the one who speaks to seekers, whether they stand inside Israel's borders or far beyond. This truth matters because it overturns narrow thinking. It destroys the lie that God belongs to one group. It reminds us that he has always been greater than the lines men draw, and it confronts us with the reality that his presence is universal, eternal, unconfined. And this is why Paul would later write in Romans that what can be known of God is plain, his invisible attributes have been seen since creation, so that no one is without excuse. For his fingerprints are upon all things, and his name has been whispered since the beginning. The forgotten worship of Yahweh before Israel teaches us that God has always been revealing himself, that he has never been silent, that even in the darkest generations there were witnesses who remembered, who called upon his name, who lifted their voices to the eternal. And this is not history alone, but prophecy for the present. For just as he revealed himself then to unexpected people, so he reveals himself now, and he speaks even where tradition says he should not. And his spirit moves beyond denominations, beyond borders, beyond human institutions. For Yahweh is not confined. He is the living I am, and his revelation is as wide as creation itself. The lesson is sharp. If Yahweh revealed himself to Balaam, though he resisted, if he revealed himself to Job, though he was outside the covenant, if he received Jethro, though he was Midianite, if he ordained Melchizedek, though he stood outside Abraham's line, then we must accept that his grace is wider than our categories. His voice speaks beyond our systems, and his call reaches into every land and every heart that seeks him. And this means that even now he is speaking to those we might overlook, to the humble, to the outsider, to the stranger, to those who do not carry the name of tradition, yet carry the spark of truth in their hearts, and they are heard by him. For his recognition is not based on heritage, but on the posture of the soul. This is why the gospel proclaims that all who call upon the name of Yahweh shall be saved, and in Christ that name is revealed as Yahweh saves. For Jesus is the fulfillment of the ancient name, the living embodiment of the I Am, and his mission makes plain what was always true, that God's heart is for the whole world, not for one people only, and that his salvation extends to all who believe, no matter their origin. I have told you of Yahweh's name spoken before Israel, of Melchizedek blessing Abraham with bread and wine, of Jethro rejoicing in the deliverance of a people not his own, of Job confessing his Redeemer, though he lived in a land far from Canaan, and of Balaam whose lips uttered prophecy, though his heart was divided. And as I draw these visions together, I feel the weight of one truth pressing against my spirit, that Yahweh has never been absent, never bound, never silent, but has always been the eternal one who reveals himself to those who seek. And this realization lingers in me like the afterglow of fire upon the night. When I sink into the records, I see lights scattered across ages, souls whose devotion rose like sparks, carried by winds of time, some great, some forgotten, yet all joined by one thread. They called upon the eternal, and he answered. And this tells me that the story of God is larger than any border men have drawn, larger than Israel, larger than the church, larger than the creeds of any age. It is the living current of the I Am flowing through creation, and whoever touches that stream drinks of his presence, whether they knew his name as Yahweh, as Elohim, as Redeemer, or simply as the breath within their breath. The more I look, the more I see that the eternal works in ways men overlook. He plants truth in unexpected soil. He raises witnesses in forgotten lands. He speaks through lips considered unworthy, and he calls hearts who never imagined themselves chosen. And in this I find hope, for it means that no one is outside his gaze. No one is too far. No one is beyond his reach, and his mercy has always been wider than the fences of men. I remember how many who came to me in my time sought to know if God had abandoned them, if their suffering was proof that heaven was closed, and I would tell them what I tell you now, that Yahweh is not far, that even in the silence he is near, that even before you thought to seek him, he had already been seeking you. For this is his nature. He is the shepherd who goes after the one the Father who runs to meet the prodigal, the Redeemer who stands even when all else falls away. As I let these visions settle, I realize that the forgotten worship of Yahweh is not truly forgotten. It is alive in the very air we breathe. It is written in the longing of the soul. It is hidden in the moments when you sense a presence beyond yourself, a voice that whispers in conscience, a light that flickers even in despair. And this worship is not about temples, not about nations, not about rituals. It is about recognition, the recognition of the eternal I am who always is and always will be. My heart rests in this awareness that the same God who spoke to Enosh, who walked with Abraham, who was confessed by Job, who was worshipped by Jethro, who compelled Balaam's tongue, is the same God who speaks now, who sees you, who calls you. And though ages have passed and empires have risen and fallen, his name has not changed, his presence has not waned, his love has not diminished. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so the conclusion is simple yet weighty. The story of Yahweh does not begin with Israel, and it does not end with you. It flows through every generation, through every people, through every heart that dares to turn toward him. And the question that remains is not whether he is present, but whether you will recognize him, whether you will call upon him, whether you will listen when he whispers, for his voice has always been near, and his worship has always been alive. As I leave this vision with you, I leave it as a seed. May it take root in your soul. May it remind you that you are never forgotten, that the Eternal has always known your name, that before you ever sought him, he sought you, and that the forgotten worship of Yahweh is in truth the eternal worship, unbroken, unbound, and still alive in the hearts of those who say yes to the I Am.